It started with the hat, not mine and certainly not Wolfe's. I was in the front room when the doorbell went off at 3:10, and when I opened the door, it was pressed into my field of vision like a tired guest at a crowded party. A fedora, the kind that had once been proud of its felt, but was now resigned to sagging on the head beneath it. That head belonged to a man who had the look of someone who had run out of both options and starch. His coat was rumpled, his collar bent, and his face had the hollow-eyed determination of a fellow who had rehearsed his speech a dozen times on the walk over, but still wasn't ready to deliver it. I let him in because I'm polite like that. He mumbled his thanks, tugged at the brim of the fedora like it was the only thing holding him together, and followed me to the office. Wolfe was in his chair, holding a book half the size of my torso and twice as heavy in appearance, but his eyes slid over the man like he was an item of grocery that Fritz had mistakenly left in the hall. "Mr. Wolfe," I said, "this is a man with a fedora." "And trouble." The man coughed, straightened, and managed a faint smile. "The hat isn't the trouble, Mr. Goodwin. My name is Elliot Ross. I'm sorry to intrude." "You have," Wolfe rumbled, not looking up from his book. His tone was as warm as a January stoop. "Proceed." Ross perched on the edge of the red leather chair, the one most of our visitors either sink into or clutch like a lifeboat. He kept his hands pressed together as if squeezing them would keep his nerves from leaking out. "It's not a matter of crime. Not yet. It's theft, but not the kind the police would bother with." "Then why?" Wolfe asked without lifting his gaze. "Have you come to me? Because it involves sabotage, subtle, precise sabotage, and because I've been told," he hesitated, looking over at me for encouragement, "that you dislike being trifled with, that you prefer clarity and control." That pried Wolfe's eyes off the page. He shut the book with one finger in it, like he meant to pick up exactly where he left off after brushing this human mosquito aside. His lips tightened, which I knew was Wolfe's version of curiosity. "You are an attorney, a financier?" Ross shook his head. "An archivist. It's a private research foundation on East 79th. We maintain rare manuscripts, legal, literary, scientific. Recently, several key files have been disturbed, not stolen outright, but tampered with, notes rearranged, pages shifted, the work of someone with access and intention. My colleagues dismiss it as an error, but I know better. It's deliberate, a pattern, and if it continues, the damage will not only ruin reputations, it may destroy the entire collection's credibility. I had to admit the guy was selling it, even if his hat wasn't." Wolfe leaned back, shut the book, and let it rest on his lap. "You have appealed to the police?" They laughed. "There's nothing missing," they said. "How do you prove malice?" "In a misplaced annotation." "That," Wolfe said, "is an admirable question." He closed his eyes, which usually means dismissal. "I was about to escort Mr. Fedora to the door and let him go complain to the janitor when Wolfe's lids twitched open again. He pointed a finger at me. "Archie, beer." I fetched the bottle and the glass, and by the time Wolfe had poured and sipped, Ross had sat straighter, as if a miracle might still be pending. Wolfe set down the glass and regarded him. "I detest interruptions," Wolfe said, "and you are one." Yet I confess his voice dropped to that low register he used when his brain had already begun its gymnastics that I dislike sabotage more. "Very well, you may tell me the particulars. If I find your claim a chimera, you will leave. If not, perhaps we shall explore it." Ross exhaled in relief and reached into his briefcase. He pulled out a folder with a neat string tie and placed it on Wolfe's desk like it was dynamite. "These," he said, "are copies of the files I believe have been tampered with. Look at the margins, the corrections, you'll see. Someone is rearranging history." I glanced at the fedora. If this was what passed for history these days, then I had a hunch we weren't just dealing with ink and paper. Trouble had walked in, and it had a crumpled hat for a calling card. Ross's folder sat on Wolfe's desk like an unwanted guest at dinner. Wolfe didn't open it right away. He never did. His eyes lingered on the string tie, then flicked to me, which meant he had already assigned me to the role of interpreter, errand boy, and occasional whip. I leaned against the edge of my desk, waiting for the cue. "You'll permit me," Wolfe said at last, "to examine these with care. Mr. Goodwin will note what you say." Ross nodded quickly. His shoulders seemed to deflate the moment Wolfe's attention pinned him. The man's nerves were more frayed than his fedora. He tapped the arm of his chair. "I've catalogued anomalies in 5 separate manuscripts. They span centuries and subjects, but each one was consulted recently by different researchers. Not all of them are trustworthy." "Names," Wolfe ordered. Ross cleared his throat. "Dr. Miriam Kent, historian. She specializes in colonial legal documents. Then there's Conrad Yates, a wealthy patron with too much influence and too little discipline. He insists on direct access to the collection. He's careless or pretends to be. A third is Anthony Garrison, one of our own staff. Ambitious, competitive, too ambitious. Then Evelyn Drake, an independent scholar. We allow her access because of her reputation, but her funding is suspiciously opaque. And finally, Martin Dell, our security officer. He has keys, he has oversight, and he thinks the rest of us are children." I scribbled, though I could have remembered them without ink. The way Ross spat out the list, he might as well have been reading the guest roll for a dinner where arsenic soup was the main course.
"Why," Wolfe said, "do you think one of them is tampering?" Ross licked his lips, because each manuscript they touched afterward bore irregularities. Notes moved, punctuation shifted, words blotted, faint but purposeful. At first I dismissed it, but a pattern emerged. Someone wants to distort the record subtly enough that it won't be discovered until it matters, and by then the credibility of the Foundation and my career will be ruined. I'll say this for Elliot Ross, he wasn't here for small potatoes. Anyone can lose sleep over a misplaced comma, but he had the air of a man who believed sabotage of semicolons could topple empires. Wolfe shut his eyes and folded his hands over his belly. That meant digestion was in process, not of beef or beer, but information. I could almost hear the gears grind. I glanced at the clock. If Ross expected instant fireworks, he didn't know his man. The silence stretched long enough for Ross to start fidgeting with his hat. Finally, Wolfe's eyes opened. Sabotage requires intent. Intent implies motive. What motive could justify meddling with dead ink? Ross leaned forward. His voice had sharpened. Money, reputation, control. A distorted document could alter ownership rights, or prove or disprove a claim in court. It could undermine a rival's research. The Foundation has holdings that touch on everything from land deeds to corporate charters. One well-placed alteration could sway millions. That got Wolfe's eyebrows moving. Only slightly, but enough for me to note it. He reached for the folder, untied the string with those thick fingers that always made paper look delicate, and extracted the first sheaf. He scanned it slowly, his lips moving once, as if silently pronouncing a phrase. Then he set it down and reached for his beer. "You presume," Wolfe said after a sip, "that one of your colleagues, under guise of scholarship, is altering your archives for future gain. That is plausible. But why do you come here, to me?" Ross's answer came out low, almost desperate. "Because no one else believes me. They say I'm seeing ghosts. My superiors want quiet. They'd rather dismiss me than stir a scandal. If I accuse someone without proof, I'm finished. I need help to see what's really happening." I expected Wolfe to grumble and toss him out like yesterday's Times. Instead, he let out a slow grunt. His mood was shifting, and I knew why. The brownstone was Wolfe's temple, and order was its doctrine. Tampering with files, rearranging them with sly fingers, was trespass of the intellectual kind, and Wolfe
hated trespass more than dietitians hate butter. He looked at Ross again. "You will, of course, leave these with me. Archie will accompany you tomorrow morning to the foundation. He will observe your suspects. He will ask questions in my stead." Ross's relief nearly knocked him sideways. He pressed the hat against his chest. "Thank you, Mr. Wolfe. You won't regret it. I wasn't as convinced. If tomorrow meant playing watchdog over a room full of eggheads and patrons, I'd rather spend it with Fritz peeling onions." But Wolfe had spoken, and that meant my fate was sealed. Ross stood, shaky but lighter. Wolfe waved him off with one finger, like brushing away dust. When the front door closed behind him, Wolfe sighed and shifted in his chair. "Archie," he said. "Yes, sir? This is an intrusion." "Sure," I agreed. "But it's the kind you like. Rearranged papers, invisible fingerprints, suspicion in the margins, sabotage without footprints. It's got all the marks of Pui." Wolfe opened his eyes to their fullest width, which was still only half of normal human capacity. "It has the marks of mischief. Whether it merits my attention remains to be seen. Go, find out." That was my marching order, and I knew better than to argue. I gathered Ross's folder, set it in my drawer for overnight safekeeping, and started planning the angles. If Ross was right, someone was writing trouble in invisible ink, and if he was wrong, then I'd waste a morning at the library while Wolfe enjoyed Fritz's eggs with herbs. Either way, it was my job. The next day at 9 sharp, I was at the foundation, wearing my best suit for intimidation and my best smile for access. The building was a converted mansion with polished floors that made my footsteps echo like I was starring in my own detective radio hour. Ross met me in the foyer, looking as though he'd been up all night counting commas. He hustled me into the archives room, a long hall with glass cases and reading tables. The air smelled of parchment, dust, and a hint of polish, the scent of history in captivity. And there they were, his suspects, each busy at their stations like actors pretending not to know they were being watched. Dr. Miriam Kent was tall and brisk, with steel-grey hair pinned tight and eyes sharper than the quills she probably preferred over ballpoints. Anthony Garrison hunched at a desk, scribbling notes in a hand that looked fast enough to ignite the paper. Evelyn Drake had her face buried in a manuscript, her lips moving faintly like she was conjuring spells. Conrad Yates leaned back in his chair with the kind of slouch money buys, tapping a gold pen against the table, and Martin Dell stood near the door, arms folded, scanning the room as though daring anyone to sneeze on his watch. Ross whispered their names in my ear like a nervous tour guide. I gave him a nod, but kept my eyes moving. This wasn't Wolfe's office anymore. Out here, the air was mine to breathe, and it was my job to spot the cracks in the scenery. Someone here was rearranging history. I just had to figure out which one. I pulled out a notebook and settled into a chair. If they thought the guy in the tailored suit with the easy grin was just another researcher, good. I intended to let them stew in their own silence while I watched. Suspicion, like soup, tastes best when left to simmer. And if I was lucky, before the day was out, one of them would add a little too much seasoning. The room had the hush of a church, but none of the reverence. Each figure bent over their work as if the manuscripts were fragile saints, though, if you looked closer, you could see the fault lines. Dr. Kent's lips were pursed so tight they could have cracked a walnut. Yates's gold pen clicked against the table with a rhythm that begged for attention. Garrison's hand darted across the page like he was in a race against his own ambition. Evelyn Drake had the air of someone hoping the text might whisper secrets directly to her, and the guard looked more interested in catching humans than catching errors. I let them simmer while I strolled past the cases, eyes politely wandering over maps and parchments, but ears tuned to every scratch of a pen. Wolfe would never have set foot in this mausoleum, but I was there on his behalf, and that meant drawing out the little cracks that no one else noticed. Ross hovered beside me like a nervous uncle, introducing me at a family reunion. "Dr. Kent," he said, his voice higher than usual. "This is Archie Goodwin, an associate of Mr. Wolfe." Her eyes cut up at me. Cold, sharp, quick. "Nero Wolfe, the detective?" she asked, her tone making it sound like she had just spotted a stain on a priceless volume. "The very one," I said, flashing the kind of smile that tends to soften most folks, though not her. "I'm here to poke around a little, see if I can help Mr. Ross sort through a problem." "A problem?" she said, arching an eyebrow. "Mr. Ross does have a talent for inventing them." With that, she bent back over her manuscript, her fingers tracing a margin note, as if daring me to contradict her. "That was one." Ross's shoulders hunched, but he pressed on. "Conrad, may I interrupt?" Yates swung around in his chair, the pen twirling like a baton between his fingers. He looked me up and down, then smirked. "An associate, huh? You look more like a collection agent. What's the fee?" "Depending on the client," I told him, keeping a grin. "Sometimes money, sometimes patience." "Then I pity you," he said, laughing under his breath, before turning back to his manuscript. But the laugh didn't reach his eyes, and the tapping of his pen had grown sharper. That was two. I crossed to where Garrison sat, his notes spread out like a field of weeds. He didn't wait for an introduction. "Whatever Ross told you, he's exaggerating," he said flatly, without lifting his head. "Mistakes happen, no conspiracy required." "I didn't say anything yet," I replied. I didn't need to. "Ross is predictable, always chasing shadows. If he can't find an error, he invents one. Ask anyone." He scribbled faster, the nib of his pen digging grooves into the paper. His jaw worked like it wanted to grind his teeth down to powder. That was three. Evelyn Drake finally looked up from her manuscript. Her eyes were dark and wide, and there was something feverish in them. "Mr. Goodwin," she said softly, "these texts speak louder than men. They're alive. You can sense it if you listen, but Ross wants to cage them in labels and catalogues. He doesn't understand." She pressed her palm to the vellum like it was a living chest, rising and falling beneath her hand. I nodded politely. "I'll keep that in mind." That was four. Dell, the guard, had been watching me the whole time. When I met his gaze, he grunted. "If you're here to keep Ross company, fine, but stay out of my way. I'm the one responsible for keeping this place clean, and I don't need amateurs stirring trouble." "That's a warning?" I asked. "It's advice." His voice was flat as stone, and he didn't blink. That was five. I'd only been in the room for 15 minutes and already had a full hand of suspects, each one delivering their own brand of suspicion like it was in the house. Wolfe had asked for a motive, and I was already swimming in it. Kent despised Ross's fussing. Yates had the swagger of a man who liked bending rules to fit his wallet. Garrison was itching to climb ladders by kicking rungs out from under rivals. Drake seemed capable of rewriting the Magna Carta if she thought the spirits told her to, and Dell just liked control. Any one of them could have had reason to rearrange a few papers. I made a slow circuit of the room, jotting in my notebook and occasionally asking an innocent question. Each answer told me less than their tone did. Kent answered briskly like a surgeon with no time for small talk. Yates joked too much, deflecting attention. Garrison bristled, defensive before I'd accused him of anything. Drake rambled about authenticity and voices in ink. Dell never let his eyes leave me, even when someone else coughed. Around 11, Ross tugged my sleeve. "Do you see what I mean?" he whispered. "They don't treat it seriously." "Oh, they treat it seriously, all right," I whispered back. "Just not the way you want." I picked a table and sat, pretending to look through one of the catalogues, while really watching the dance unfold. A page turned too loudly here, a sigh there, a furtive glance when they thought no one noticed. It was a performance, and I had front row seats. By noon, Ross excused himself to fetch some files from another room, leaving me alone with the suspects. The air shifted the moment he left, like a teacher had walked out of a classroom. Kent muttered something under her breath, Garrison smirked, and Yates leaned back even further, stretching his legs wide. Evelyn Drake hummed softly, tracing a line of text. Dell's jaw tightened. I decided to stir the pot. "Funny thing about manuscripts," I said casually, closing the catalogue. "You move one comma and a man's fortune might turn upside down. Imagine what shifting a whole phrase could do." The silence that followed was rich. Kent's pen froze. Yates stopped twirling his. Garrison tapped. His foot. Evelyn's humming faltered. Dell's arms folded tighter across his chest. "Well," I added, "just a thought." Ross returned a minute later, carrying a box of files. The tension eased, though not completely. He set the box down in front of me. "These are some of the volumes that have been disturbed." I thought perhaps, "Save it," I told him. "I'll look through them later. For now, I've seen enough." And I had. Wolfe would want impressions, and I had a basketful. Each of them wore their guilt like a badly tailored suit, awkward, revealing, impossible to hide. The trick was figuring out which one was guilty of more than attitude. When I left, I made a point of thanking each of them by name, just to watch how they reacted. Kent gave me a curt nod, Yates a mocking salute, Garrison a muttered "sure," Drake a distracted smile that didn't reach her eyes, and Dell nothing but a grunt. Outside, the autumn air felt cleaner, like I'd been holding my breath inside. Ross trailed me to the curb. "Do you believe me now?" he asked. "I believe you've got enemies," I said, signaling for a cab. "Whether one of them is actually monkeying with your precious commas, I'll let Wolfe decide." Ross looked stricken, like I'd handed him back his own fears without the wrapper, but I didn't soften it. My job wasn't comfort, it was clarity. Back at the brownstone, I handed Wolfe my notes and sat while he read. He didn't ask questions, not yet. He skimmed, sipped beer, and let the silence spool out until I was about ready to fill it myself. Finally he said, "All 5 are plausible. All 5 had the opportunity." "Sure," I said, "but if I had to place a bet, I'd spread it thin. None of them is exactly subtle, but subtlety is what we're chasing." "Not subtlety," Wolfe corrected, lifting a finger. "Design. The saboteur wishes not to erase, but to rearrange. That requires a mind that values control more than credit. That narrows the field. Care to name names? Not yet." His eyes shut, but I could tell he was arranging them like chess pieces on his inner board. "Tomorrow you will return, provoke them. People reveal themselves under pressure." I leaned back, resigning myself. Another day among the manuscripts, breathing dust and suspicion. Wolfe hadn't decided yet who was guilty, but one thing was certain. The brownstone was no longer undisturbed. Someone had dropped a crumpled fedora on our doorstep, and the ripple was only beginning. The next morning, Wolfe informed me with his usual lack of flourish that I would not be spending the day in civilized company. His instructions were neat: to observe, prod, and extract. Each of the 5 suspects needed more than a passing glance in a dusty room. They needed air, a stage where their real selves could breathe without manuscripts muffling them. That meant I'd be stretching my legs across Manhattan while Wolfe sat in the office, rooted in a place like a walnut tree that had no intention of moving, even if the forest caught fire. I didn't complain much. I started with Conrad Yates because moneyed men are like cream. They rise to the top but often turn sour if left out too long. His townhouse on Park Avenue looked like it had been stolen directly from a museum exhibit titled Gilded Excess. The doorman seized me with suspicion until I dropped Wolfe's name in casual conversation, and suddenly I was being ushered inside, as if my shoes had polished themselves. Yates greeted me in a silk dressing gown that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe, drink in hand though it wasn't yet noon. "Well, the watchdog returns," he said, with a grin. "Come to see if I've vandalized the Magna Carta in my spare time?" "Not exactly," I said, making myself comfortable in an armchair that swallowed me whole. "But I like to know what hobbies my suspects keep. Some men golf, some play poker, some tamper with history." He chuckled, though the laugh had the hollow tone of glassware that's been chipped. "My dear fellow, my only hobby is maintaining this lifestyle, which requires patrons and papers. If I rearranged a comma, it would be to amuse myself, not to topple empires." "Still," I said, "you've got access to the Foundation's archives, more than most. That gives you the opportunity. The question is, what's the payoff?" He raised his glass. Control, influence. Isn't that what we all want? But don't mistake me, Goodwin. I prefer to buy influence, not scribble it in margins. That's for smaller minds. He leaned back, smug as a cat that's eaten half the canary and hidden the feathers. Whether he was bluffing or confessing to a different sin altogether, I left unconvinced. Next was Dr. Miriam Kent. Her office at Columbia was lined with books that looked like they'd grown roots in the shelves. She received me with the warmth of an accountant auditing a stranger. "I have no time for baseless suspicions," she said crisply, "especially from Mr. Ross. He's an anxious man, incapable of tolerating ambiguity. Manuscripts are riddled with it. He interprets every inconsistency as an attack." I let her wind down before stepping in. "Maybe, but sabotage isn't ambiguous, it's intentional." Her eyes, grey and piercing, fixed on me. "If you want to know intent, ask Ross why he's so desperate for attention. He fears irrelevance more than dishonesty." Do I respect him? No. Do I waste my career falsifying notes? Absolutely not. If I wanted fame, I'd publish a book. Tampering with marginalia is the work of a fool. She said it with such authority that for a second I almost believed her. Almost. I decided to skip subtlety. "Do you dislike him enough to see his career ruined?" For the first time, her composure cracked. A thin smile tugged at her lips. "Mr. Goodwin, in academia, most careers collapse without anyone lifting a finger. I needn't bother pushing." That was as close to candor as she'd give, so I left her to her fortress of books. Anthony.
Garrison was easier to find. He was holed up at a cafe near the Foundation, tapping notes into a laptop like a man chiseling stone. I slid into the seat across from him without invitation, still scribbling fast enough to smoke the paper. His scowl could have curdled cream. "Look, Goodwin, I don't need this. Ross is paranoid. He sees patterns where none exist. If pages are misplaced, it's because the system is old, not because someone's plotting world domination." "Funny," I said, stirring my coffee. "Ross thinks otherwise. He thinks someone's messing with history to make sure the future pays out nicely." He snorted, and then he's a bigger fool than I thought. "You think I'd risk my career altering a manuscript when I can just outpublish him? I don't sabotage rivals, I bury them with work." He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "But if someone wanted to sabotage him, it wouldn't be hard. He's too jumpy. One rearranged note and he panics. If you ask me, someone's just winding him up." That was interesting, too interesting to be casual speculation. Garrison knew how Ross ticked. The question was whether he knew, because he'd watched, or because he'd wound the clock himself. Evelyn Drake required a different approach. She lived in a shabby apartment on the Lower East Side, walls lined with stacks of books and journals that looked ready to topple at any second. She greeted me with a distracted smile, like she'd already forgotten inviting me in, which she hadn't. "The texts," she murmured, "are like rivers, always shifting. Anyone who tries to freeze them doesn't understand."
I stepped carefully around a pile of papers threatening to avalanche. "And do you shift them yourself, Miss Drake?" Her eyes widened with indignation. "Never. I read them. I listened to them. They reveal themselves. To change them would be sacrilege. It would kill the voice." She clutched a parchment scrap as though it were alive. "But others don't hear. They might tamper, yes, but not me. I'm a listener." Her sincerity rang loud, but sincerity is often the best disguise. I left before the walls of books buried us both. That left Martin Dell. He was trickier. Guards don't like being questioned off duty. I caught him outside the foundation, lighting a cigarette with the kind of efficiency that said he didn't waste time on pleasantries. "What do you want, Goodwin?" he asked, exhaling smoke like punctuation. "Answers," I said. "You've got the keys, you've got oversight. If anyone could tamper without raising suspicion, it's you." He snorted. "And what would I gain? A pay raise? More hours? No thanks. I keep the place locked, and that's that. If Ross can't keep track of his papers, it's not my problem. He's jittery. Jittery men break down, and when they do, they look for scapegoats." He jabbed his cigarette toward me. "Do you want advice?" "Don't let Ross drag you down with him." That was his song, and he wasn't changing the tune, but he hadn't denied.
Access, just motive. And men like Dell rarely played for glory. They played for leverage. By late afternoon, I was back in the cab headed for the brownstone, my notebook fat with contradictions. Wolfe was in his chair, eyes closed, lips pursed, as Fritz brought in a tray of beer. I laid out my findings while Wolfe listened with the patience of a man dissecting a recipe. "So," I concluded, "we've got Yates with money and arrogance, Kent with disdain for Ross, Garrison with ambition and a little too much insight into Ross's nerves, Drake with her mystical attachment to texts, and Dell with the keys and the authority. Any one of them could have done it, and none of them wants Ross to be right." Wolfe opened his eyes. "Excellent! You have gathered character sketches. But sketches do not suffice. We must have evidence, however slight, that the sabotage is deliberate." He took a long swallow of beer. "Bring me something tangible, Archie. Not attitudes. Attitudes are as common as leaves." "Sure," I said. "I'll just ask the saboteur to sign their work next time." He ignored me. His mind was already elsewhere, arranging the pieces. As I turned toward my desk, I noticed the folder Ross had left behind, still sitting where Wolfe had placed it. The string tie had been loosened, but Wolfe hadn't bothered retightening it. Papers were visible at the edges, neat as Fritz's napkins, except one corner wasn't quite aligned. "Wolfe?" I said slowly. "Did you move these?" "No," he said without opening his eyes. The corner was folded faintly as if someone had opened the drawer, rifled, and tried to put it back the way they found it. Except they hadn't done it well enough for my eye to miss. Someone had trespassed in the brownstone. The sabotage had followed us home. I stood over the desk, staring at that folder like it had just grown fangs. A corner bent, a sheet slightly out of alignment on its own. It could have been my imagination. But I don't imagine things like that. Wolfe certainly didn't. He opened his eyes long enough to watch me tug the drawer all the way open and spread the papers across my blotter. Everything looked neat. Too neat. Which is exactly what told me it wasn't. "Fritz," I called toward the kitchen, "you been filing Wolfe's correspondence for him while I wasn't looking?" Fritz appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a towel, and gave me his usual look of mild reproach. "Archie, you know better. I never touch Mr. Wolfe's files." His tone suggested that if I had accused him of spitting in the stockpot, it would have been about as offensive. "Right," I said. "Forget I asked." When he'd gone back to his pots and sauces, I looked at Wolfe. "We had a visitor. Obviously," he said, shifting in his chair, his lips pursing so hard they could have whistled without sound. "The question is how."
I didn't like the question. We don't just have locks at the brownstone, we have fortifications. I've been told by more than one burglar who lived to regret trying that they'd sooner knock over a bank than force our door. I didn't see anyone slip in. The door was locked when Ross left. If somebody tampered, it had to be before I got back, which means, Wolfe said, that while you were conducting your praiseworthy but inconclusive excursions, someone entered this house. He took a slow sip of beer. That is intolerable, I agreed, though I didn't say it out loud. You don't need to tell a volcano it's erupting. I checked the front lock, the windows, even the bolt on the back door. Nothing had been forced, no scratches, no Jimmy marks, which meant keys, or skill of the kind you don't learn in a summer workshop. When I returned to the office, Wolfe was scowling not theatrically but genuinely. His house was his sanctum. Violating it was like knocking his beer over deliberately. It wasn't just trespass, it was sacrilege. Do we call Saul? I asked. Not yet. His tone was clipped. First, we ascertain what, if anything, has been altered. So I went through the folder page by page while Wolfe watched. It was slow, maddening work. I'm no scholar, but I can spot when a line has been shifted. One annotation in the margin looked faintly smudged, as if someone had pressed it harder. Another note had a different slant to the handwriting than the rest. Tiny details, yes, but the sort Wolfe feeds on. When I finished, he had closed his eyes again, arms folded. Subtle, he said. The intruder is confident. To enter this house, touch these papers, and depart without detection. This is a declaration. Sure, I said, the declaration being that they can stroll in and out of our parlour while we're not looking. I don't like it. Nor I, Wolfe admitted. He opened his eyes. Archie, tomorrow you will keep watch at the foundation again. You will press them harder. These manipulations are not random. The saboteur sought to prove his reach even into my own files. That arrogance is useful. It will expose him. I was about to argue that leaving bait out for a cat burglar in our own house wasn't my idea of a secure plan, but Wolfe's tone cut that short. When Wolfe's pride was challenged, he was more immovable than stone. The only thing to do was adapt. The next morning I was back at the foundation, sharper than before. Ross greeted me in the foyer, pale and anxious, like he hadn't slept since birth. I gave him the short version someone had poured through the files even in Wolfe's house. His eyes went wide enough to swallow his face. Then none of us are safe, he whispered. Don't start carving your tombstone yet, I told him. But someone's playing a dangerous game and it's not just about your reputation anymore. Inside the reading room, I played my part, calmly, observant, annoying enough to rattle nerves. I asked Dr. Kent if she often worked late hours. Her reply was crisp. I work until I've accomplished something. Unlike others, I asked Yeats whether his gold pen had ever corrected history as well as signed checks. He grinned, but his fingers tightened on the pen. Garrison snapped when I suggested that Ross's paranoia might be justified. He sees ghosts, he barked, loud enough for Kent to glance up. Evelyn Drake muttered about spirits again, clutching her manuscript. And Dell, always Dell, watched the room with his arms folded, as if waiting for someone to confess just by breathing wrong. Around midday, I excused myself, pretending I had errands. Instead, I planted myself at a cafe across the street where I could keep the foundation doors in sight. An hour passed, then 2. Around 3, Yeats emerged, smirking as if he'd just won a hand of cards. A half-hour later, Drake drifted out like a sleepwalker. Garrison stormed off shortly after, jaw tight, muttering into his phone. Kent left with a stack of papers under her arm, eyes forward, not acknowledging anyone. And Dell? He stayed. Guarding or plotting, it was hard to tell. I returned to the brownstone by evening. Wolfe was waiting, as always, like a spider in the center of his web. "Well?" he asked. "They all look guilty," I said. But no smoking gun. Yates smirks, Garrison snaps, Kent sneers, Drake communes with her ghosts, and Dell glares. If suspicion were evidence, we'd have the case locked. "Phooey," Wolfe said. "Suspicion is abundant, proof is scarce, yet our intruder grows bold. That boldness will undo him." He leaned forward, and his eyes narrowed. "Archie, tonight we will set a snare," which is how I found myself prowling the hallways of the brownstone after midnight, armed with nothing more than patience and a sharp ear. Wolfe had insisted I sleep on the couch in the office, door cracked, ears open. He retreated to bed, though I'd bet a stack of his favorite orchids he wasn't sleeping. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that magnifies every tick of the clock. Around 1, I heard a faint scrape, almost nothing, but in our house, almost nothing means a lot. I slid from the couch, padded to the hall, and waited. A shadow moved against the wall, slow, deliberate. Whoever it was knew the layout, knew enough to avoid creaking boards. I waited until the shadow stretched toward the office door, then flicked on the light. No one was there, except the folder. It sat open on my desk, a page half pulled out, as if the intruder had been interrupted mid-act. The window was still locked, the door still bolted, no trace of forced entry. But the page bore a fresh crease, unmistakable. I stood in the silence, my pulse steady. Wolfe's trap hadn't caught the rat, but it had flushed him. Proof that he was willing to walk through locks and shadows to tamper with papers. Proof that this wasn't Ross's paranoia. It was a deliberate campaign. When Wolfe entered the office in his robe a few minutes later, he took one look and nodded grimly. "Good," he said. "Now we have confirmation." "Good?" I asked. "He was right here in our office." "Exactly. Which means he cannot resist. And that, Archie, will lead him to reveal himself." I shoved my hands in my pockets, staring at the page with its fresh scar. Whoever this saboteur was, he had just declared war not only on Ross, not only on the Foundation, but on Wolfe himself. And that, I knew, was the worst mistake he could make. If there's one thing that can rattle Wolfe's bulk out of its customary calm, it's an intruder inside the brownstone. But if there's one thing that can steady him right back again, it's the realization that arrogance creates cracks. By morning, he had shaken off the offense and moved straight into strategy. He ate his breakfast with the deliberate relish of a man who refuses to let enemies disturb his eggs. I sat across from him, replaying the scrape of that shadow in my head, wishing I'd caught more than a crease in a page. "We have confirmation," Wolfe said, dabbing his lips with his napkin. "The trespasser cannot resist leaving his spoon. He is compulsive. Such men are dangerous, but they are also predictable. They cannot refrain from proving their reach." "Fine," I said, "but while he's proving his reach, he's also proving he can outmaneuver locks and bolts. I don't like sleeping in a house where ghosts wander." "Phooey, no ghosts, only men, and men always betray themselves." He drained his coffee and waved me toward the phone. "Call Mr. Panzer." Saul Panzer is the kind of detective who could follow a fish through water without getting wet. I got him on the line, and half an hour later he was in Wolfe's office, sitting calm and steady as always. Saul never wastes words. Wolfe laid out the facts tampering at the Foundation, an intruder bold enough to toy with our files, and a list of 5 suspects, each with motive enough to boil soup. Saul listened without interruption, nodding once or twice, his sharp eyes making me feel like I was on the wrong side of the observation for a change. "You want surveillance?" Saul said finally. "Precisely," Wolfe replied. "One of these 5 has been moving freely by stealth or connivance. I want him to observe his comings and goings, his associations, his opportunities. He must have resources or assistance. Archie will coordinate. Report only to me." Saul nodded, rose, and was gone within a minute. That's his way, no theatrics, no fuss. If I vanished that quickly, Wolfe would accuse me of rudeness, but when Saul did it, it was efficient. By noon I was back at the foundation, keeping my own watch. Ross cornered me as soon as I stepped in, eyes bulging with fresh panic. "I heard noises last night," he whispered. "Someone was moving in the stacks. I told Dell, but he laughed, said it was the building settling. Buildings don't settle by rifling through parchment," I told him. "What time?" "Near midnight." His voice shook. "I'm telling you, Mr. Goodwin, someone is orchestrating this with precision. I kept him calm long enough to steer him into the reading room. The suspects were there, spread out as before." Kent was buried in documents, jaw set like iron. Yates lounged, scribbling occasionally with that gold pen, his grin too wide for comfort. Garrison attacked his notes like they owed him money. Evelyn Drake whispered softly to herself, fingers trailing over margins as though caressing a lover. And Dell loomed near the door, arms crossed, eyes sharp. Same tableau, but tension had thickened. My entrance was met with a collective tightening, subtle but real. They knew I was watching harder now. I made my rounds with questions designed to needle. To Kent. "Do you always work so late? Ross swears someone was prowling last night." Her lips thinned. I don't answer to Ross's paranoia. To Yates, "That pen of yours ever finds it useful for more than autographs?" He grinned, but his knuckles whitened. To Garrison. "If someone wanted to spook Ross, one rearranged note would do it. That sound like fun to you?" His glare could have scorched parchment. To Evelyn. "Do the voices ever tell you what to erase?" Her eyes flashed offended. "I listen, I do not destroy." And Dell, when I leaned close and said, "Funny how trouble happens on your watch," replied without hesitation. "Trouble happens because people don't follow rules. Keep to yours, Goodwin." They were cracking, each in their way, and Wolfe, back at the brownstone, would know how to read those cracks. I took my notes, gave Ross a few calming words that didn't calm him, and headed home. Saul was already waiting in the office, his hat on his knee. Wolfe gestured for me to sit as Saul gave his report in his clipped style. Watched Yates, left Foundation at 3, went to a club in Madison. I played cards until midnight, no contact with others. Kent went home, stayed in, lights on in her office until 2. Garrison met a man near Bryant Park who couldn't hear the conversation. Lasted 15 minutes. Drake went straight home, no visitors. Dell left the Foundation at 11, returned twice. Keys, obviously, didn't enter while I watched. That was plenty of meat for Wolfe. He leaned back, eyes half shut. "So, Mr. Garrison met a man in secret. Mr. Dell has an opportunity. Miss Drake lives in clutter, vulnerable to obsession. Mr. Yates flaunts. And Dr. Kent dismisses. All maintain appearances. Yet one came here. One entered my house." "Oh, that still burns you," I said. "It does," Wolfe admitted, "and it should. To trespass here is to seek insult. He believes himself clever. He is not." He turned to Saul. "Continue. Focus on Garrison and Dell. Archie will return tomorrow, but with a different purpose. Archie, you will provoke. Introduce the idea that I am closing in. Watch who flinches." I didn't argue. Wolfe's strategy was unfolding. And when he played his games of pressure, my job was to keep the suspects from seeing the strings until they were tight around their throats. The next day at the Foundation, I followed orders. I let it slip casually that Wolfe had found something. That phrase alone was enough to stir the pot. Yates scoffed too loudly, his laugh brittle. Kent snapped that scholars didn't answer to detectives. Garrison dropped his pen, cursed, and shoved his notes into a folder. Evelyn looked at me with wide eyes and whispered, "He hears them too." "And Dell?" He gave me a stare that could have cracked glass, then left the room without a word. Ross, naturally, looked like he might faint. "What did Wolfe find?" he hissed at me when we were alone. "Nothing yet," I said. but he doesn't need much. That night, Saul phoned in another report. Dell had met with Yates in a bar uptown. No documents changed hands, but their conversation was heated, gestures sharp. Garrison had been seen entering a law office after hours, staying 20 minutes, leaving empty-handed. Kent remained at her desk, grinding through papers as if trying to bury the world under footnotes. And Evelyn wandered through a second-hand bookstore until closing, leaving with nothing but whispers. The net was tightening. I could feel it. Wolfe could too. When I laid all this out, he nodded once. "Pressure," he said. "Apply it further. They are squirming. Soon, one will reveal the fulcrum." He reached for his beer, but his eyes stayed fixed on me. "Archie, tomorrow evening, invite them here, all of them. Tell them Mr. Wolfe requires their cooperation in an inquiry. If they balk, insist. They will come." "Sure," I said, "and when they do, what's the plan?" "The plan," Wolfe said, with that faint smile that means trouble for someone, "is to stop their scurrying and fix them in place. Only then can the truth be pried open." It wasn't reassurance. It was a verdict waiting to be delivered. And as I looked at the folder still lying on my desk, edges scarred from a saboteur's touch, I knew the game had shifted. The intruder had wanted to show reach, but Wolfe was about to show control. And between those two, I knew where my money lay. Getting 5 people with clashing egos into Wolfe's office was a feat I wouldn't have bet money on. But when Wolfe says, "They will come," he's usually right. My job was the heavy lifting phone calls, coaxing, needling, and, when necessary, issuing polite threats, dressed up in nice phrases. By the afternoon of the appointed day, each one had agreed, some with more venom than others. Yates laughed and said he was eager to see Wolfe's trick. Kent snapped that her work was being interrupted, but she would attend. Garrison growled that he had nothing to hide. Evelyn Drake whispered that she wanted to know what Wolfe had heard, and Dell said only, "Fine," before hanging up. That line-up would have made a Broadway producer nervous. The meeting was set for 8. Fritz outdid himself with dinner earlier, but Wolfe only nibbled. That's how I knew the stakes were high. He doesn't toy with his food unless he's already feeding on something bigger. When the doorbell rang at 5 minutes to 8, I was in position to receive the first arrival. Yates, of course, sauntered in like he owned the place, his tie too bright, his smirk too wide. Kent followed soon after, stiff-backed, looking like she regretted stepping foot inside. Garrison arrived late, his coat flung over one arm, expression tight. Evelyn slipped in quietly, almost reverently, as though our front room were a chapel. Dell came last, scanning the hallway as though making sure we weren't staging an ambush. I ushered them all into the office, where Wolfe sat in his chair, massive, immovable, and already the center of gravity. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wolfe began, his tone smooth as cream but heavy with authority, "you are here because I require your assistance. A pattern of tampering has emerged in the Foundation's archives. Mr. Ross suspects sabotage. I agree with him." He let the words settle. No one spoke. Wolfe never rushed into silence. He let it tighten until it squeezed. "Someone among you has been altering, shifting, or obscuring documents. Last night, the same hand reached into my own files. That is insufferable." The silence broke with Yates's laugh. "Are we suspects then? All of us?" "You are," Wolfe said without heat. Kent bristled. "Mr. Wolfe, this is absurd. I am a scholar. I have no interest in amateur theatrics." "You have interest in discrediting Mr. Ross," Wolfe countered. "That alone is motive enough." Garrison leaned forward, fists tight on his knees. "This is ridiculous. Ross imagines enemies. Now you're indulging him." Evelyn's voice floated in, soft and trembling. "But he's right. The texts are unsettled. Someone is moving them. I can feel it." Dell, arms folded, finally spoke. "If you think I'd risk my position tampering with papers, you're mistaken. I'm there to keep order, not create chaos. Wolfe raised a hand. The room quieted grudgingly. I do not need protestations. I need the truth. Mr. Goodwin has observed you. Mr. Panzer has followed you. You have each displayed behavior consistent with concealment, but the guilty party has also displayed arrogance. To trespass in this house required both access and confidence. I will discover who. That got their attention. Their eyes darted to me, then to one another. Wolfe had placed them in the circle, and now he was slowly drawing it tighter. I watched sweat bead on Garrison's forehead. Yates tapped his pen against his knee too quickly. Kent pressed her lips so thin they nearly disappeared. Evelyn clutched her purse, whispering under her breath. Dell sat motionless, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. Wolfe gestured toward the folder on his desk, the same one the intruder had touched. This, he said, is bait. Whoever tampered with it could not resist marking his presence. That compulsion is the key. Saboteurs who fancy themselves clever always overreach. He let the words hang again, sipping his beer, gazing at each of them in turn. His eyes lingered longest on Yates, then shifted to Dell. I caught it, though the others didn't. That was Wolfe's way press without moving a muscle. I filled in the silence. What Wolfe means is, you've all made yourselves look guilty in one way or another. The question is, who couldn't resist proving it? Who had to show he could outsmart locks, slip past eyes, and leave fingerprints where none should be? That's the person Wolfe will expose. And let me give you a tip when he says he'll expose you. He means tonight. Yates chuckled, but this time it sounded more nervous than amused. If you've got a point, make it. Otherwise, some of us have better things to do. Wolfe's eyes half closed. Patience, Mr. Yates. The truth requires patience. I have been patient, and now the pressure is intolerable. I will not allow this insult to continue. He leaned forward slightly, and though it was a small movement, the effect was volcanic. Archie. I straightened. Tomorrow you will accompany Ross and ensure that each of these persons is denied private access to the archives. Work will be observed, notes double-checked. Let us see who chafes most under constraint. Those who protest loudest will tell us what we need to know. That set off a rumble. Kent objected at once, calling it an affront to her scholarship. Yates barked a laugh and said surveillance was beneath him. Garrison muttered curses under his breath. Evelyn looked frightened, but said nothing. Dell scowled and insisted oversight was his job, not mine. Wolfe lifted a finger, silencing them. You misunderstand, he said. This is not a request. It is the condition under which I continue my inquiry. Refusal will be noted, compliance will be observed, and in the end the saboteur will be unmasked. The weight of his words filled the office like thick smoke. No one moved. Finally Kent rose stiffly. Very well, I will submit, but I will not be slandered. Yates followed with a shrug. If you want me watched, watch away. Just don't bore me. Garrison muttered something about a circus, but he stayed seated. Evelyn gave a trembling nod. Dell glared at me, then at Wolfe, and said only, Fine. Wolfe leaned back, satisfied. Good. The stage is set. Now we wait for the play to conclude. I escorted them out one by one, their expressions a mixture of anger, fear, and disdain. When the door finally closed, I turned back to Wolfe. You're herding cats, and you know it. Tomorrow's going to be fun. He closed his eyes, exhaling. Tomorrow will be decisive. Their tempers will fray, and the saboteur will reveal himself not by word, but by compulsion. He will not endure the cage. I didn't argue. Wolfe was right more often than wrong, and when he was wrong, it usually just meant he was waiting for the rest of us to catch up. Still, as I looked at the folder on the desk, I couldn't shake the feeling that our intruder wouldn't wait for tomorrow to prove himself again. Pressure does funny things to people, and Wolfe had just turned the screw. The next evening, the brownstone felt more like a courtroom than a home. Fritz had cleared the air with the smell of beef bourguignon, but once the plates were gone and Wolfe was settled behind his desk, the atmosphere turned to stone. At Wolfe's instruction, I had invited every one of the suspects back, this time with the promise of resolution. It was the sort of promise that meant different things to different people: hope for Ross, dread for the guilty, and curiosity for the rest. By 8 o'clock, the office was filled again, the red leather chairs occupied, the air thick with suspicion and unspoken hostilities. Ross sat stiffly on the edge of his seat, his hands twisted together, eyes darting between Wolfe and the folder on the desk. Yates slouched in his chair with practised ease, his gold pen twirling like a toy, but his grin looked strained. Kent perched with upright severity, lips tight, every movement screaming impatience. Garrison leaned forward, restless, tapping his knee as though itching to bolt. Evelyn Drake sat quietly, eyes downcast, murmuring faintly as if communing with unseen companions. Dell remained near the back, arms folded, gaze hard, his body a barrier more than a presence. Wolfe let them sit in silence, as always. He had closed his eyes, but the weight of his presence filled the room until even Yates stopped twirling the pen. Finally, he opened them and looked around, each face caught and measured before he spoke. "You are gathered here because one of you has engaged in a campaign of sabotage. Manuscripts at the Foundation have been altered subtly, but with intention. You know this. And when those papers were brought to me, that same hand could not resist tampering further, even within my own home. That was folly." His gaze hardened. "You have made me a participant. That was your mistake." The words landed like stones. Garrison shifted uncomfortably. Kent drew in a sharp breath. Yates chuckled faintly, though no one joined him. Evelyn murmured, "The Tex wanted to be free," under her breath. Dell's stare never wavered. Wolfe gestured to Icy. "Archie," I stood, holding the folder. "This is what started it. You've all seen Ross's paranoia, but paranoia doesn't crease pages in locked drawers. Someone touched this when no one should have." I set it down in the center of Wolfe's desk. Wolfe doesn't like trespass. And the person responsible is in this room. Yates smirked. "That's dramatic, Goodwin. You should try Broadway." "Save it," I shot back. "Wolfe doesn't stage dramas, he ends them." Wolfe leaned forward, planting his elbows on the desk. "Consider yourselves observed. Mr. Goodwin has reported your words, your expressions, your petty defenses. Mr. Panzer has traced your movements. You are not opaque to me. You have each motive: envy, ambition, greed, disdain, obsession, control. But only one of you has displayed the compulsion to prove himself clever, to reach beyond necessity and leave his spot where it would be found. That compulsion betrays you." The silence was thick. Kent broke it first, snapping, "Then name him, and let's end this charade." "In time," Wolfe said evenly. "First, I will illustrate. Mr. Goodwin, bring me the sheet that was most recently creased." I pulled the marked page from the folder and handed it over. Wolfe held it delicately between his fingers, then let his eyes travel the room. "This crease is fresh, deliberate. Not by accident, not age. It is the mark of someone who had no reason to touch it except to declare presence. I despise declarations in my house." Ross leaned forward, almost trembling. "So it's true someone has been altering them." "Of course it is true," Wolfe said curtly. "The only question is who and why. The why is simplest: to distort history, to influence claims of property, rights, or reputation, perhaps to destroy Mr. Ross's credibility so thoroughly that his voice would never again be trusted. who is revealed by arrogance. I need only observe who could not endure scrutiny without betraying himself. I stepped in again, watching faces. We've seen you all crack under pressure. Some of you laughed too loud, some of you bristled, some of you whispered to ghosts, some of you used your authority like a shield, and one of you thought you could prove yourself untouchable by slipping into Wolfe's office and leaving fingerprints in the form of creased paper. That was your undoing. Yates shifted in his chair, tapping his pen too fast. Garrison's jaw clenched. Kent's nostrils flared. Evelyn looked down, whispering faster now. Dell's arms tightened across his chest. Wolfe let the tension stretch to the breaking point. "Mr. Ross," he said finally, "your instincts were correct. You have an enemy. That enemy is here. Before I name him, I will give each of you the opportunity to deny, though denial is irrelevant." Kent spoke first, sharp as a blade. "This is baseless. I have no need to ruin Ross. He ruins himself with his own incompetence." Yates followed with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "If I wanted to destroy Ross, I'd buy his precious manuscripts and burn them." "I don't need to smudge ink," Garrison snapped. "I don't sabotage. I work out. That's more than Ross can say." Evelyn's voice rose, trembling. "I listen to the texts. I do not change them. I would never." She gripped her purse so tightly her knuckles whitened. Dell growled, "I kept order. If something happened, it wasn't on my watch." Wolfe folded his hands across his middle, eyes half shut, and delivered the line like a hammer, all irrelevant. "The truth is already plain. One of you cannot resist flaunting control, even when silence would serve better. One of you, by arrogance, has condemned himself. I will name him when I am ready." He leaned back, closing his eyes. "Until then, you will stew. The guilty knows who he is. The rest will realize soon enough." The room bristled. Garrison muttered curses. Kent stood, then sat again. Yates kept spinning the pen faster and faster.
Evelyn's whispers broke into fragments. Dell didn't move, but his glare could have burned a hole in the wall. Wolfe ignored them all, sipping his beer as if the tension were merely seasoning. Ross sat trembling, both vindicated and terrified. I watched them, one by one, noting who sweated, who cracked, who masked their nerves. Wolfe wasn't just tightening screws, he was letting the pressure cook until the guilt boiled over. It wasn't my favorite kind of game, too much silence, too much waiting. But I had to admit, watching 5 suspects squirm in Wolfe's office was almost as satisfying as catching them in the act. By the time I escorted them out, the air was charged enough to spark. None of them looked relieved. They left in silence, each wrapped in their own thoughts, their own fears. Ross stayed behind, staring at Wolfe like he'd witnessed a miracle. "You'll name him soon?" he asked, voice thin. "Yes," Wolfe said without opening his eyes. "Very soon. He will name himself. That is what arrogance ensures." I guided Ross to the door. When I returned, Wolfe had leaned back, lids closed, lips pursed. He looked as though he might drift to sleep, but I knew better. He was waiting. And when Wolfe waits, it's only because he's already 3 moves ahead, watching for the moment when the game turns in his favor. The next day began with Wolfe in a darker mood than usual. He ate his breakfast in silence, and when I ventured a comment about the weather, he waved it off like a fly. That was my cue to keep quiet until he was ready. He didn't stay silent long. By the time I'd finished my coffee, he set down his fork and gave me a look that could have flattened an alibi. "Archie," he said, "the time for maneuvering is over. Tonight we end it." I didn't need to ask what it was. The tampering, the trespass in our office, the arrogance that had marched across Wolfe's sanctum as though it were public property, he meant all of it. He was ready to deliver the verdict. My role was obviously to fetch the suspects and make sure they sat in the office long enough to squirm.
I spent the day laying the groundwork, calls, reminders, the subtle insistence that refusal was not an option. By 8 of that evening, the stage was set again. Ross arrived first, pale and nervous, clinging to his briefcase like a drowning man to driftwood. The others followed in short order, each looking tighter than before. Yates swaggered, but the smirk was strained. Kent's mouth was a hard line, her eyes colder than a January sidewalk. Garrison's jaw worked as though he were chewing gravel. Evelyn entered with wide, feverish eyes, murmuring softly. Dell came last, arms folded, his stare daring anyone to cross him. Wolfe let them settle, then cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will dispense with preliminaries. You are here because one of you has tampered with documents of historical and legal value. You have interfered with Mr. Ross's work. And worse, you have trespassed in my house. That is not forgivable." His gaze swept the room, slow and deliberate. "Tonight we name the culprit." Ross gripped his chair. The suspects shifted. Yates spun his pen. Kent glared. Garrison muttered under his breath. Evelyn whispered to her purse. Dell stood like a statue. "You have each displayed motive," Wolfe continued, "but motive alone does not suffice. Mr. Yates, your arrogance and wealth could buy influence, but you prefer to flaunt rather than finesse. Dr. Kent, your disdain for Mr. Ross is clear, but you seek recognition through scholarship, not through sabotage. Mr. Garrison, your ambition is palpable, but you compete by production, not by stealth. Miss Drake, you are obsessed, yes, but obsession seeks communion, not distortion. And Mr. Deleu, above all, had the keys, the oversight, and the authority. You alone could enter without suspicion. You alone could have moved through locks and bolts. The silence was absolute. I could hear Ross's breath, fast and shallow. Wolfe leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Mr. Dell," he said, "you are the saboteur." Dell's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. Yates let out a sharp laugh. Kent muttered, "I knew it." Garrison swore under his breath. Evelyn whispered, "The Guardian was the thief." Ross looked as though he'd been struck by lightning. I kept my eyes on Dell. He stood perfectly still, arms still folded. "That's your conclusion," he said finally, his voice low. "You think I risked my career to shuffle papers?" "I do not think," Wolfe said. "I know. Only you had the means to enter both the Foundation and this house. Only you had the confidence to believe you could tamper undetected. You could have remained silent, but arrogance compelled you to demonstrate, reach first at the Foundation, then here. The crease in that page was not evidence for me, it was a boast, and boast's betrayal." He raised a finger. "Furthermore, you have a motive. Mr. Ross has been inconvenient to you, pressing for oversight you considered your prerogative. Discrediting him was your path to removing him." Dell's lips curled. "That's thin." "On the contrary," Wolfe replied, his tone sharpening, "it is exact. Mr. Panzer observed you returning to the Foundation at odd hours. You believed yourself unseen. You met Mr. Yates in private. Perhaps you thought to enlist his influence. But Mr. Yates does not have the subtlety to be your partner. No, this was your enterprise alone. You tampered to unseat Ross, to destroy his credibility, and you trespassed here to gloat." Ross half rose from his chair. "I knew it!" he cried. All this time, "Sit," Wolfe commanded, and Ross sat as though struck. Wolfe turned back to Dell. "You may deny, but denial is irrelevant. I have laid the chain, link by link. You are the only one who fits it." All eyes were on Dell. He stood silent, the muscle in his jaw twitching. Finally, he spoke. "Ross is a fool. He doesn't deserve that archive. He doesn't know how to protect it. If I'd let him go on, he would have ruined it himself. I did what was necessary. His words came like gravel, but the confession was plain enough. That," Wolfe said, is for the law to decide, Archie." "On it," I said, already reaching for the phone. Dell didn't resist when I dialed the precinct and arranged for a detective we knew to come by. He didn't argue when I told him he'd be waiting in the front room until they arrived. He just stood there, arms folded, eyes hard, as if daring the world to call him guilty. But the air in the room had changed. The others shifted in relief, their guilt lifted. Ross slumped, vindicated at last, though trembling still. Evelyn whispered a prayer. Yates slipped his pen back into his pocket with a smirk that looked more nervous than triumphant. Kent adjusted her glasses, as though the restoration of order were proof she'd been right all along. Garrison muttered something I didn't catch, but his shoulders eased. Wolfe leaned back, eyes closed, satisfied. "It is finished." When the police came to take Dell away, the room emptied quickly. Ross lingered, thanking Wolfe with a fervour that earned only a grunt in response. When at last the door closed behind them all, the brownstone was quiet again. I stood by the desk watching Wolfe pour himself a fresh beer. He raised it slowly, savouring the weight of victory. "You know," I said, "I thought you might pin it on Yates. He's obnoxious enough to make anyone guilty." "He is a fool," Wolfe said, "but fools boast openly. Saboteurs boast in shadows. Mr. Dell was the only man who could not resist proving his cleverness. And cleverness, Archie, is often fatal. He drank, and the office settled back into its natural order. Outside, the city went about its restless churn, but inside the brownstone, justice had been served with precision. Ross had his vindication, the suspects had their release, and Wolfe had his satisfaction. As for me, I had another case to file and another evening of watching Wolfe savour both beer and victory. Both earned the same way, slowly, deliberately, and with absolute control. The night after Dell's confession, the brownstone was unusually quiet. Not that it's ever rowdy, but there's a difference between the natural hush Wolfe cultivates and the silence that comes after an intruder has been rooted out. Fritz moved about the kitchen as though restoring harmony with ladles and spices, and Wolfe sat in his chair, the weight of the day gone from his face, if not his body. I was at my desk, filing the last of my notes, making sure the case went into the drawer, where future reference and Fritz's dust cloths could fight over it. The cops had taken Dell off without fuss, and Ross had stumbled out afterward, practically glowing with relief. The others had scattered to their corners of the city, their egos dented but intact. The drama was finished, at least for them. For us, it lingered a little longer. Wolfe had a glass of beer at hand, untouched so far, and his lips pursed the way they do when he's turning an idea around for its flavour. Finally, he reached for the glass, sipped, and set it down. "Archie," he said, "it is always the same. Arrogance condemns itself." "That's one way of putting it," I said, closing the drawer. "Another way is, Dell couldn't keep his hands off what didn't belong to him. He liked proving he could slip in and out without anyone the wiser." "That's not just arrogance, it's compulsion." "Compulsion is arrogance made chronic," Wolfe replied. "The desire not merely to achieve, but to demonstrate superiority. He could have accomplished his ends more quietly. Instead, he flaunted them. He wished not only to destroy Mr. Ross, but to declare himself the master of order. Even here, that was his undoing." I leaned back in my chair. He almost pulled it off. If I hadn't noticed that crease in the folder, we'd still be arguing about commas. "Phooey." Wolfe's eyes half closed. "You would have noticed? You always do. The method of discovery is incidental. The outcome was inevitable. That was Wolfe all over. He never liked admitting luck had a seat at the table. Still, I let it slide. I'd had enough of Dell's brand of arrogance. Wolfe's was at least familiar. Fritz came in then bearing dinner roasted pheasant with a sauce, so rich it could have been served at a banker's banquet, accompanied by delicate potatoes and asparagus that looked like they'd been hand-picked by angels. Wolfe brightened. Food has that effect on him, more than victory itself. As we ate, he spoke little, though I could see in his eyes he was still savouring more than just the pheasant. By dessert, he leaned back, content, and said, "It is a curious irony. Mr. Dell sought to protect order by creating disorder. He wished to discredit Ross to maintain control. In doing so, he destroyed himself. Men seldom see that their grasp at power ensures its loss." "That's philosophy," I said, spearing a strawberry. "What Ross will care about is that he still has his job and his reputation. What Dell will care about is that he's out both. And what I care about is whether Fritz baked enough tart to go around." "Glutton," Wolfe muttered, though without rancour. He finished his portion, wiped his lips, and pushed his plate away. There will be no further interruptions tonight. That was as close as Wolfe came to declaring a truce with the world. After Fritz cleared the table, Wolfe reached for one of his books and disappeared into its pages. I took the opportunity to step out for a short walk. The night air was cool, the city restless, but I found myself enjoying the simple fact that no one was slipping through our locks or creasing papers in the dark. Sometimes victory is just having your house back. When I returned, the office was as I'd left it. Wolfe immersed in his reading, beer glass half empty, the orchids upstairs probably smug with attention. I settled at my desk, glanced once at the folder still resting in its drawer, and shut it firmly. That chapter was closed. Around 11, Wolfe shut his book and spoke without looking up. "Archie, remind me never again to accept a case involving archivists." "Noted," I said. Though to be fair, it wasn't the archives that came knocking. It was the Fedora, he grunted. "Hats." Another nuisance. That was his way of putting a period on the whole affair. He rose, a slow, deliberate heave, and announced he was going up to bed. I watched him leave, the house returning to its familiar rhythm. No intruders, no arrogance scribbled in the margins, just the quiet order Wolfe demanded. I switched off the desk lamp, leaned back for a moment, and thought about Dell. He'd had the keys, the power, the authority, and yet it wasn't enough. He'd wanted more, the thrill of showing he could bend rules, that he was smarter than the rest. In the end, that was what gave him away. Wolfe was right that arrogance always condemns itself. It just needed the right pair of eyes to catch it in the act. As I climbed the stairs later, the house felt like itself again, steady and unshaken. Dinner had been served, justice delivered, and Wolfe had the last word, as always. Some things, I thought, don't need tampering. They work just fine the way they are.